Warning! You're about to experience Metamodernism Uncensored, a podcast for diagnosing the cultural rot of the postmodern world and searching for real truth. It's time to question everything, especially yourself.
Welcome to Metamodernism Uncensored, the podcast diagnosing our postmodern world and its cultural rot and attempting to push through to achieve metamodern synthesis.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. So imagine for just a second a single book that is so incredibly dangerous, like so utterly devastating to a superpower that just typing a copy of it in secret could literally get you disappeared.
Disappeared into a frozen labor camp, yeah. It's wild.
And we are not talking about, stolen military secrets or bomb schematics here. We're talking about a manuscript of human stories.
Just stories.
Yeah. Today, for this deep dive, we aren't just looking at a book. We are looking at, a weapon. A weapon that helped dismantle an empire.
It's hard for us, sitting here comfortably in the modern West, to even comprehend that level of intellectual contraband.
Oh, totally.
Like, we're just so used to information being cheap.
Right.
And abundant. And mostly harmless.
Yeah, exactly.
But the text we are unpacking today is fundamentally about the lethal power of ideas, both to build these totalitarian nightmares and, to tear them down.
Precisely. So today we're taking a really heavy deep dive into some profound source material. We're looking at a post from a libertarian blog called The Opposition.
Which is run by Sean Dempsey.
Right, Sean Dempsey. The sources describe him as a free stater up in New Hampshire. He advocates for returning to the founding principles of the American Republic.
Got it.
But the core of his post, like the absolute heart of what we are going to dissect for you today, is a foreword written by Jordan Peterson.
The clinical psychologist.
Yes, and cultural commentator. Specifically, this is his foreword to the 50th anniversary edition of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's absolute masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago.
And our mission today is to deeply analyze Peterson's diagnosis of modern cultural shifts, right?
Yeah.
But doing it through the lens of Solzhenitsyn's historical warnings.
Exactly.
Because Peterson is looking at the mid-20th century Soviet Union and, he's drawing a very stark, very direct line straight into the way we speak today.
Like how we think and censor and argue about politics right now.
Yeah. He's arguing that the ghost of that era has not been exorcised at all.
Not even close. But hey, before we get into the weeds here,
How?
I need to make something crystal clear to you, our listener.
This is important.
Yeah. Our goal today is not to endorse or condemn Jordan Peterson's broader political views. We are not here to act as cheerleaders for the political left, and we aren't here to carry water for the political right either.
Right. We're strictly impartial guides on this one.
Exactly. The text we are looking at deals with some of the darkest themes of the human experience: totalitarianism, Marxism, extreme inequality, and just massive historical atrocities.
Heavy stuff.
Super heavy. Our job is simply to unpack the architecture of the arguments laid out in this text. We just want to see what they reveal about historical cycles and human nature.
That neutrality is vital, I think. Because the themes Peterson raises, group guilt, the weaponization of compassion, erasing the individual, they touch on the rawest nerves of our society right now.
Well, for sure. People get very heated.
And if we get defensive, we totally miss the mechanics of the argument.
Right. So you might be asking, why should you care about a foreword to a 50-year-old book about the Soviet Union?
Fair question.
Well, because, as you have undoubtedly noticed, we are living in a time of intense, almost religious political polarization.
Yeah, that's undeniably true.
The rhetoric of group identity, where you are judged or elevated or condemned based entirely on the categories you belong to, that is the dominant language of our time.
And understanding Peterson's reading of Solzhenitsyn offers a theoretical framework for why modern political language operates that way.
Exactly. It gives us a lens to understand the underlying mechanics of modern outrage and cancellation and all this division.
It provides the historical blueprint. We often think our modern culture wars are totally unprecedented.
Right, like we invented this stuff on Twitter.
Exactly. But this text argues that they are anything but unprecedented. The vocabulary has changed, sure, but the psychological mechanisms of dividing the world into pure victims and wicked oppressors.
It's running on very old software.
Very old, very dangerous software.
Okay, let's start with the sheer physical reality of the book Peterson is analyzing. The text describes the Gulag Archipelago as a massive 3-volume experiment.
An experiment in literary investigation.
Yes. Published in 1973, and it is this bizarre, brilliant hybrid of journalism, history, and biography.
Peterson actually refers to it as one continuous, extended scream of outrage.
Which is such a powerful phrase.
What's fascinating here is that phrase, experiment in literary investigation. It's brilliant because Solzhenitsyn didn't have access to state archives.
Right, he couldn't exactly just FOIA the KGB.
No, not at all. He had to map an invisible, continent-spanning network of secret prisons by interviewing 227 survivors.
Wow, 227.
Yeah. Relying on his own memories, synthesizing these tiny fragments of information, all while he was actively hiding from the secret police.
That is just mind-blowing. And the impact when it was finally published was staggering, right?
Oh, completely. The single-volume abridgment alone sold 30 million copies.
30 million.
In 35 languages.
30 million copies. I mean, that is pop star level saturation for a book detailing the systemic torture and starvation of millions of human beings.
In frozen labor camps. Yeah.
It is arguably the darkest material a human being could possibly consume.
It really is. But what Peterson focuses on is the specific geopolitical claim regarding that massive saturation.
Okay.
He states it as a matter of pure historical fact that the Gulag Archipelago played a primary role in bringing the Soviet Empire to its knees.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to a modern ear, that sounds, well, like a romantic exaggeration.
Does sound like a movie plot.
Right. A book bringing down a nuclear-armed, continent-spanning empire. We usually assume empires fall because of catastrophic wars or like total economic collapse.
Or violent revolutions.
Exactly. The idea that a manuscript defeated the KGB just sounds impossible.
It does. But Peterson doesn't ignore the hard geopolitics here. The text acknowledges that the Soviet system was economically unviable.
Right. It was crippled by corruption.
Totally. And entirely reliant on slave labor and terror. He also gives immense credit to the geopolitical pressure cooker of the 1980s.
So he mentions Reagan, right?
Yeah, he highlights leaders like Ronald Reagan who shattered diplomatic norms by bluntly calling it an evil empire.
Which was a massive deal at the time.
Huge. Alongside the spiritual defiance of Pope John Paul II and the fierce courage of the labor unions in Poland.
But the text argues that all of those external pressures wouldn't have been enough without Solzhenitsyn removing the ideological foundation. Is that the argument?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can fight an empire economically, sure, but as long as the people inside the empire and the intellectuals outside of it still believe in the fundamental moral righteousness of the system.
The empire can just sustain incredible physical damage and keep going.
Right. Peterson argues that Solzhenitsyn's literary dismantling of the ideology itself was the crucial linchpin.
So he defeated a geopolitical empire not by outgunning it,
but by making it intellectually, morally, and spiritually shameful to defend.
It makes me think about how dictators view human life versus how artists view it.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, because the text mentions that Stalin notoriously and just disdainfully described the tragedy of mass death as a mere statistic.
Right. 1 million dead is a statistic, 1 dead is a tragedy.
Exactly. Stalin relied on the blur of large numbers to hide the blood. Like, he needed that anonymity.
Yes, the anonymity of the statistic is essentially the shield of the totalitarian.
So Solzhenitsyn bypassed the statistic entirely. He documented the specific, agonizing, soul-chilling personal stories.
He gave the victims their names back.
Let's make this concrete. Instead of saying, 1 million people were displaced, Solzhenitsyn writes about the loyal party member who comes home to find his wife gone.
And his children taken by the state.
Right, and his own neighbors testifying against him at a show trial just because they wanted his slightly larger apartment.
It's terrifying.
It is. Solzhenitsyn forces the reader to sit in the freezing train car with that specific man. He completely removes the anonymity.
And that removal of anonymity changed how the entire world understood historical atrocities. Well, Peterson points out that before Solzhenitsyn, a shocking number of people in the West tried to excuse the horrors of the Soviet Union.
Really? Just brushed it off?
Yeah, Western intellectuals would argue that the death camps were just a temporary glitch.
Wow.
They blamed it on the cult of personality surrounding Stalin, or they said the leadership was uniquely corrupt.
Or, let me guess, they claimed the utopian principles of Marxism just hadn't been put into proper practice yet.
You nailed it. That was the most common excuse.
Which is a refrain that has literally never gone away. The classic, real communism just hasn't been tried yet.
Right. But the text argues that Solzhenitsyn definitively, fatally proved otherwise. He demonstrated that the death of tens of millions wasn't just a failure of implementation.
It wasn't a bug in the system.
No, not a bug caused by bad management. It was a direct, inevitable, causal consequence of the philosophy itself.
Okay, that's a huge claim.
It is. Peterson actually refers to it as the theology driving the communist system. The argument is that the hypothetically egalitarian doctrines of Karl Marx actually contained hidden within them sufficient hatred and resentment.
And a denial of individual responsibility.
Exactly. Sufficient denial to produce nothing but poison and death.
Okay, so exposing the historical reality of the physical gulags was Solzhenitsyn's achievement. But Peterson is taking that and using it to critique the fundamental philosophical building block of Marxism itself.
Right. He's looking at how this ideology views the individual human being.
And this brings us directly into the concept of identity, which is arguably like the most fiercely debated topic in our culture today.
Oh, absolutely.
The source text dives into Peterson's critique of Karl Marx, specifically focusing on how Marx reduced man to merely a member of an economic class.
This is the core philosophical pivot. For Marx, history was not a story of individuals making choices.
What was it then?
History was nothing but the battleground of collective groups. The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Man was a member of a class, and his individual soul, his personal moral choices,
They were utterly irrelevant.
utterly irrelevant compared to his group identity. The individual is erased. Only the category remains.
And Peterson draws a terrifyingly direct parallel between that Marxist erasure of the individual and the way we operate right now in the modern day.
Yes, he does.
He explores how this reduction to group identity functions now, and he introduces a philosophical concept to explain it. He talks about our thrownness.
Thrownness. Yeah.
Let's unpack that, because it's a dense philosophical term, originally from Heidegger, I believe.
Yeah, Heidegger. So, thrownness refers to our arbitrary placement in the flow of time and existence.
Like none of us chose to be born.
Exactly. We are all thrown into the world, and we are thrown into it with varying, completely randomly distributed traits.
It's the ultimate cosmic lottery. You don't choose your natural talents, your baseline IQ, your ethnicity.
Your race, the culture you're born into.
Right, your biological sex, or whether your parents are billionaires or entirely destitute.
And Peterson notes that because of this thrownness, every single one of us accrues some form of undeserved random privilege from the vagaries of our birth.
That makes sense.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, even being born in the 21st century with indoor plumbing and antibiotics is a massive privilege you did absolutely nothing to earn.
You were just thrown here.
Right. But Peterson points out that modern identity politics takes these arbitrary traits, these accidents of birth, and uses them to categorize people into collective groups.
Assigning them comparative moral status.
It's like,
So, instead of viewing you as an individual who has to navigate your specific set of random advantages and disadvantages, modern identity politics just looks at your categories.
Yep.
If you belong to a category that historically had power, you're automatically assigned the status of oppressor. If you belong to a category that historically suffered, you are automatically assigned the status of victim.
And when you reduce people to those historical groups, you entirely strip away their individual agency.
Because it doesn't matter what you actually do.
Exactly. When group identity supersedes the individual, collective guilt replaces individual responsibility.
Right.
Peterson's argument is that because we all benefit unfairly in some random way, if you accept the logic of group identity, we can all potentially be labeled as oppressors based entirely on immutable characteristics we cannot change.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second and push back on Peterson's framing, because I think a lot of listeners might feel a sense of friction right now.
Sure, go for it.
If it is objectively true, and Peterson admits it is true, that everyone belongs to groups that have comparative status through no effort of their own.
Right, the cosmic lottery.
Yeah. Isn't it perfectly natural for a society to try and balance those scales? Like, if we look around and see that the dice were loaded from birth, isn't the most compassionate, decent response to try and adjust the system to account for that thrownness?
That's the argument, yeah.
So why does Peterson view the pursuit of this balance as so incredibly dangerous?
It is a vital pushback, and it gets to the absolute core of the tragedy here. Peterson isn't saying that wanting fairness is evil.
Okay.
The tension, the fatal flaw, arises in the method of balancing. When you attempt to balance those scales collectively at the level of the group rather than individually.
You're running the problem?
Huge problems, because you inevitably require someone to be blamed.
Ah, because if the system is unfair, someone must have designed it to be unfair.
Exactly. If the inequality of life is framed not as a tragic baseline of existence that we must endure and slowly improve, but rather as a deliberate, malicious crime committed by one group against another,
Then you need a perpetrator.
you need someone to punish. And this creates the historical mechanism of the class enemy.
Wow, okay.
Peterson argues that you cannot collectively balance the scales of historical injustice without eventually deciding that the group which randomly benefited from history must be actively punished for the crime of their arbitrary birth.
Which takes us to the historical progression outlined in the source, and it is a terrifying sequence to observe.
It really is.
It starts with solidarity.
Mhm.
The text notes that the Russian Revolution began with solidarity for the common man. And let's be honest, standing up for exploited workers seems like a completely laudable, deeply moral demand.
Right, it pitches itself as righteous.
But very quickly, that solidarity mutates into the brutal, paranoid indictment of the class enemy.
It goes from, we must help the poor worker, to, we must destroy the wicked factory owner.
And the net keeps expanding.
That is the defining characteristic. The net of who constitutes that class enemy constantly, inevitably expands. That's the historical progression Peterson traces.
So once the doctrine of group identity is established as the supreme law, the definition of the oppressor just grows wider and wider.
Exactly. Let's trace that expansion. In the Soviet context, the enemy was initially the bourgeoisie, the aristocrats, the Romanovs.
The people with actual power and wealth.
Right. But once they were gone, the revolution still needed an enemy to explain why paradise hadn't arrived yet.
Because it never does.
Right. So the net widened to the kulaks.
And it is crucial to understand who the kulaks were. They weren't wealthy barons.
No, not at all.
They were often just peasants who were slightly more successful than their neighbors. Maybe they owned 2 cows instead of 1.
Or they had managed to hire a single farmhand to help with the harvest.
But under the doctrine of group guilt, that tiny sliver of comparative success transformed them into the oppressor class.
And the revolutionaries delivered a horrific verdict. The text says they decided to eradicate the oppressors in toto.
Entirely.
Entirely. Ignoring what they sneeringly called reactionary niceties, like individual innocence.
That phrase, reactionary niceties, should freeze the blood of anyone reading history.
It's chilling.
It means that whether you, as an individual, personally exploited anyone, or whether you personally broke any laws, is totally irrelevant. Your individual behavior is just a bourgeois illusion.
Right. Let's make this relatable with an analogy.
Okay, yeah. Imagine our society decides that cars are destroying the planet.
Okay, plausible.
And pedestrians are the ultimate victims. So a new tribunal is set up, you're dragged into court, but you aren't put on trial for driving over the speed limit.
You aren't on trial for running a red light.
Exactly. You were put on trial simply for the act of owning a car. The court decides that owning a car places you inextricably in the driver class.
And the driver class is inherently, historically oppressive to pedestrians.
Right. So what is your defense in that courtroom?
You don't have one.
You stand before the judge and plead, "But, Your Honor, I am a good person. I always obey the speed limit. I stop at every crosswalk. I even give pedestrians the right of way."
And the judge looks at you with absolute contempt and says, your individual behavior is a reactionary nicety.
We don't care about your personal morality. Your guilt is your existence in the category of car owners. You benefit from the systemic infrastructure of roads. Therefore, you are the oppressor.
That perfectly captures the Kafkaesque nightmare Peterson is describing. You cannot repent for your actions because your crime is simply existing in the wrong category.
And the logic is absolute.
Absolute. No mercy for the oppressor. When this doctrine runs its course, everyone is eventually identified as an oppressor because everyone is, in his words, uncleansably contaminated by bourgeois privilege.
You're just unfairly enjoying the benefits bequeathed by history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because there is no individual guilt in this system, only group guilt expiation becomes impossible.
You can't apologize enough.
Never. You cannot prove you are a good ally. When guilt extends to the very existence of the world's misery itself, the text says, only the fatal punishment will suffice.
If everyone is guilty by virtue of their group, then the only way to serve justice is the punishment of everyone.
Now bring that framework into our modern cultural discourse.
This is where Peterson's analysis of Solzhenitsyn acts like an X-ray for today.
Yes. We don't use the term kulak or bourgeoisie in mainstream politics much anymore, But look at the mechanism of the new class enemy.
Look at the labels that are deployed to instantly dehumanize a target. It is everywhere.
Everywhere.
Depending on which extreme of the political spectrum is speaking, the enemy might be labeled MAGA, or woke, or fascist, or communist.
Or colonizer, Zionist, boomer, elite.
The specific label changes, but the mechanism is identical. Categorize, dehumanize, and punish.
The moment you are placed in the bin of the designated class enemy, your individual soul, your specific arguments, your personal innocence, erased. You become an avatar of all the historical crimes attributed to that group.
And we see the modern execution of this punishment not in physical gulags, but in what we might call the reputational gulag.
The reputational gulag, yes.
We don't need secret police to vanish people in the middle of the night anymore. We have digital exile.
If society decides you belong to the oppressor class, you can face cancellation, deplatforming, doxing, blacklisting.
And absolute algorithmic invisibility.
It goes way beyond just losing your Twitter account. We're seeing banking pressure where financial institutions close the accounts of people deemed ideologically contaminated.
Wow.
We see complete professional destruction. You are rendered socially radioactive without ever being formally imprisoned.
That is the postmodern application of the mechanism Solzhenitsyn exposed.
Exactly.
But here is the paradox that makes this so difficult to combat. These historical movements and their modern equivalents rarely pitch themselves as evil.
Right, nobody thinks they're the villain.
Nobody looks in the mirror and says, I want to be a tyrannical monster today. They usually pitch themselves as intensely moral and just.
The text notes that admirers of Marx's doctrine regarded it and continue to regard it today as an ideology of pure compassion.
The rallying cry is always to work forthrightly to free the working classes.
Or today, to protect the marginalized.
Which brings us to one of Peterson's most controversial but honestly most penetrating psychological observations. How does compassion become a mask for coercion?
This raises an important question. Peterson argues that while this collectivist doctrine is always draped in the warm language of compassion, empathy, and love,
the actual emotions driving it are different.
the actual emotional engines driving the machine are hate, resentment, and envy.
Seriously.
He suggests those darker emotions are actually much stronger and more compelling motivators for political mass movements.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is Peterson actually suggesting that compassion itself is dangerous? Because that seems like a remarkably dark, almost cynical view of human nature. Are we supposed to just abandon empathy?
Not at all. He is warning about what happens when compassion is weaponized to justify utopianism.
Okay, utopianism.
A utopia, by definition, is a perfect society. The text points out that if your end goal is pristine and heavenly, if you truly believe you are building a permanent, suffering-free brotherhood of man.
Or a perfectly equitable society where no one ever feels marginalized.
Right. Then the stakes are infinite. And if the stakes are infinite, you can justify any and all sacrifices in the present to achieve that future.
Oh, I see. It is the psychology of the purity spiral.
Exactly.
Think about it. If I believe that my political program will literally usher in heaven on earth, then anyone who opposes my program isn't just a citizen with a differing opinion on tax policy.
No, they are literally an obstacle to paradise.
They are standing in the way of eternal justice. So psychologically, silencing them, ruining them, or even killing them doesn't feel like a crime to the revolutionary.
It feels like a painful but necessary moral imperative.
The utopian vision makes all conceivable means not only acceptable, but morally required.
Especially, as Peterson Riley notes in the text, if someone else is footing the bill. The utopian is always remarkably willing to sacrifice the lives and livelihoods of other people for the sake of the grand vision.
We see this exact mechanism today. Modern calls for equity, safety, anti-hate initiatives, or the policing of misinformation are always framed as public goods.
Of course they are.
But Peterson is warning us that these calls can very quickly become moral permission slips for censorship, surveillance, mandates, and centralized control.
Yeah.
If I tell you I need to monitor all your private messages to keep the community safe from hate, the compassion is the bait, but the coercion is the hook.
That's a great way to put it. Peterson is pointing out a fundamental psychological reality here. Humans need a future to orient toward.
Right, a goal.
He compares it to the Judeo-Christian vision of the Promised Land. Yeah. We know we have to sacrifice in the present so the future can be better. We have to separate the wheat from the chaff.
But where does totalitarianism go wrong with that?
It goes catastrophically wrong because it fails to place any moral limits on who or what is deemed dispensable to achieve that future.
The end justifies the means, absolutely.
Right. It started in the Soviet Union with economic engineering, redistributing wealth from the kulaks to the state.
And the text points out this involved theft, betrayal, and mass death.
But it never stops at economics. The Soviets didn't just want to move money around. They desired the total totalitarian remaking of the human spirit.
They wanted to restructure man and woman in the image of their ideological preconceptions. The new Soviet man.
And they masked this breathtaking arrogance, this great evil, with virtue. They truly believed they possessed transcendent wisdom.
So Solzhenitsyn's great historical achievement, according to Peterson, was tearing off that mask of virtue.
He exposed the feral cowardice, the pathological envy, the deceit, and the absolute hatred for the individual that pulsed beneath the guise of compassion.
Wow. Peterson is arguing that good intentions are absolutely not enough to make us good people.
Without profound humility, our good intentions often mask a hidden, ravenous appetite for vengeance and destruction.
So, if utopian egalitarianism, this obsessive attempt to force perfect, equal outcomes across an entire society, is mathematically impossible without resorting to horrific state-sponsored coercion,
Which history shows it is.
what is the alternative? What is the reality we are trying so desperately to avoid?
According to Peterson, it is the harsh, tragic, but immutable reality of inequality.
And the text is incredibly stark in this section. Like, he pulls no punches.
He really doesn't. Yeah. Peterson lays out what he considers to be unavoidable facts of existence. He states that every single social system since the beginning of recorded time has produced inequality.
To prove this isn't just a capitalist invention, right?
Exactly. He points to Paleolithic grave sites. Even among our most distant hunter-gatherer ancestors, you see unequal wealth distribution.
Some individuals were buried with precious metals, intricate jewelry, weaponry.
While the vast majority were buried with absolutely nothing,
He even takes the argument beyond human society entirely, which is wild. He points to the intense, brutal competition among animals and plants for living space and resources.
Right.
And this part is fascinating, he scales the concept all the way up to the cosmos. He argues that inequality is built into the very physical structure of reality.
He points out that a tiny minority of privileged heavenly bodies, the stores, oppressively contain the overwhelming mass of billions of average dispossessed planets and asteroids.
It is a striking, deeply provocative metaphor. He is illustrating a concept often called the Pareto principle or the Matthew effect.
Which is the observation that across almost all domains, whether it is the distribution of wealth in economics, the height of trees in a forest, the frequency of words in a language,
Or the mass of stars in a galaxy, a tiny minority holds the vast majority of the resources.
Peterson's argument is that inequality isn't a glitch of capitalism. It is the deepest, most intractable problem built into the fabric of existence itself.
Therefore, it cannot be solved by what he calls the presumptuous ideology-inspired retooling of free democracies. Okay, but I have to push back hard on this astrophysicist analogy.
I figured you would.
Because comparing human economics to a star system feels dangerously close to biological determinism. Stars don't suffer, planets don't starve.
Asteroids don't feel the humiliation of poverty.
Right. If Peterson is using the mass of stars to say we shouldn't try to fix human poverty, isn't that just a philosophical rationalization for greed?
That is exactly the critique his detractors make.
Isn't it just a way for the wealthy to say, hey, it's just nature, don't tax me?
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
But Peterson would argue that acknowledging the reality of the Pareto principle is not a justification for cruelty.
Okay.
It isn't a command to let the poor starve because nature is harsh. Rather, he brings up these examples to demand humility. He is saying, look at the sheer scale of the problem. Inequality is a universal cosmic default. Therefore, any political revolutionary who claims they can permanently eradicate it with a 5-year plan and a few new laws is either dangerously arrogant or entirely delusional.
So it is a safeguard against the utopian arrogance we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. He contrasts this presumptuousness with the framers of the American Republic. The text points out that the American founders were decidedly not utopian.
No, they had relatively modest goals based on the slow, iterative common law tradition of England.
They recognized human imperfection. They knew we were all, in Peterson's words, corrupt and ignorant fools.
So they tried to build a system of checks and balances that we couldn't fatally damage in a fit of utopian enthusiasm.
They designed a system for flawed humans, not for perfect angels.
Peterson argues that systems rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition which emphasize the essential dignity, divinity, and ultimate moral responsibility of the individual, are the only systems that have managed to produce massive, widespread wealth alongside this inevitable inequality.
And his warning is dire. When you try to tear down those productive Western institutions in the name of pure, unadulterated compassion,
When you declare war on competence and hierarchy to achieve perfect equity,
you inevitably destroy the very mechanisms that generate the wealth needed to lift people out of poverty in the first place.
that makes sense.
Peterson looks at activists claiming to act under the inspiration of pure compassion with the deepest suspicion, because history shows that such claims almost always precede a catastrophe that harms the most vulnerable people first.
Which brings us to an entirely modern frontier of this inequality debate, one that Solzhenitsyn honestly couldn't have fully anticipated. But it maps perfectly onto Peterson's fears.
You're talking about the rise of artificial intelligence and transhumanism.
Yes, we are approaching a moment where inequality isn't just about who has more money or a better education. We are facing a potential bifurcation of the human species.
Into the cognitively enhanced and the biologically obsolete.
Exactly. If we abandon the sanctity of the individual human soul, which Solzhenitsyn defended against the Soviet machine state, how do we protect the merely human from the optimized in the coming decades?
That is the existential question. If value is only derived from a person's utility to the collective, which is the Marxist view, then the obsolete human has no value in an AI-driven world.
That's a terrifying thought.
Solzhenitsyn's insistence on the absolute transcendent value of the individual soul, regardless of their economic output, might be the only philosophical defense we have against the coming technological sorting of humanity.
But despite the undeniable historical record of these utopian failures, despite the fact that Solzhenitsyn laid bare the horrors of the Gulag for the whole world to see, these collectivist ideologies seem to be making a massive comeback.
And Peterson views this with deep, visceral alarm.
This is where he diagnoses a profound cultural historical amnesia and the alarming return of Marxist language in modern politics.
The text poses a series of incredibly pointed, frustrated rhetorical questions. It has been decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the apparent collapse of global communism.
Right.
Yet Peterson asks why it remains acceptable, even fashionable, in polite company, or at university dinner parties to profess Marxist philosophy.
Or to consider it progressive and fit for the compassionate, proper-thinking person.
If you walked into a dinner party and professed allegiance to National Socialism, you would be immediately ostracized.
Instantly.
But professing Marxism is often met with nods of intellectual approval.
And to shatter that complacency, Peterson drops some of the most horrific statistics imaginable into the text.
He reminds the reader of the butcher's bill of the 20th century.
25 million dead through internal repression in the Soviet Union. 60 million dead in Mao's China.
2 million corpses in Cambodia's killing fields under Pol Pot.
He points to the ongoing present-day struggles in Cuba and the catastrophe in Venezuela, where the text claims it has been made legally forbidden to attribute a child's hospital death to starvation.
Because admitting people are starving contradicts the state narrative of a socialist paradise.
It is a staggering, numbing litany of human suffering. No political experiment has ever been tried so widely across so many disparate cultures, on so many different continents, and failed so absolutely and catastrophically.
And so Peterson asks a haunting question. How high, then, would the bodies need to be piled?
How much empirical proof do we need before we abandon the specific utopian temptation?
Why do we avert our eyes? That is the question we have to answer. Are people just inexcusably ignorant of history?
Peterson considers a few possibilities, right?
He wonders if it is mere ignorance, a failure of our education system. He wonders if it is driven by a deep, unacknowledged envy of the successful in near infinite proportions.
A desire to tear down those who have more, masquerading as a desire to help those who have less.
But the most profound possibility he explores is our inability to comprehend the dangers of utopian visions because of our own biology.
Wait, how does biology play into it?
Because our tendency toward compassion is biologically necessary in our personal lives, within our families, within a small tribe, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, actually works.
Right. A mother gives to her infant without expecting an economic return. We need that compassion to survive.
Exactly. The fatal error is the assumption that this interpersonal compassion can scale. We don't realize that when you take the compassion of a family unit and try to apply it forcefully via centralized government coercion to a population of 300 million people,
It mutates into tyranny.
unscalable compassion becomes hatred of anyone who resists the system.
That concept of unscalable compassion explains so much of our current cultural rot. What works when you are caring for your sick child becomes a terrifying tool of coercion when a bureaucracy uses it to re-engineer society.
And because we don't understand this mechanism, we forget the lessons of the past.
Peterson strongly advocates for the Gulag Archipelago to be mandatory reading in Western high schools, just as it now is in Russia.
He asks why our teachers don't feel compelled to read the book aloud so that students can understand how good intentions pave the road to hell.
Because if we don't study the mechanisms of how these ideologies take root, we are entirely doomed to repeat the cycle.
We fail to learn what all reasonable people should have learned from the absolute cataclysm of the 20th century.
So what does this all mean? This amnesia leads directly to the collapse of shared truth, which is another major theme Solzhenitsyn tackled.
He famously released an essay titled "Live Not by Lies" just before he was exiled.
It confronts the postmodern world directly. Today, truth is increasingly viewed merely as narrative.
And when truth is just a narrative, politics ceases to be a shared search for reality and becomes nothing but a raw war over whose story gets institutional power.
Solzhenitsyn exposed that empires depend entirely on lies to sustain the cognitive dissonance of their citizens.
When you see modern debates, whether about foreign policy, domestic elections, or cultural issues, descend into a state where opponents are treated not as fellow citizens with different views, but as metaphysical villains, you are seeing the collapse of shared truth.
Disagreement is suddenly framed as misinformation, or even treason. The state or the mob demands you recite lies to prove your loyalty.
We see this constantly in war propaganda today. Whether the discourse is around Iran, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, China, or the abstract concept of terrorism, modern rhetoric often turns geopolitical opponents into demonic caricatures.
It makes any attempt at nuance or dissent seem immoral. If you question the narrative, you aren't just wrong. You are an apologist for evil.
And underlying all of this radicalization, all this desperate clinging to group identity and state narratives, is a profound meaning crisis.
Right.
Peterson reads Solzhenitsyn fundamentally as a moral and spiritual witness. He suggests that when traditional sources of meaning collapse, when belief in God, the stability of the family, the dignity of work, and the fabric of local community all erode.
People don't stop needing religion, they just redirect that religious impulse.
Exactly. Politics becomes the new religion. Activism becomes the new sacrament of confession.
The political party becomes the church, and the political enemy becomes Satan. It explains the absolute zealotry we see on social media and in the streets.
People aren't arguing about tax rates. They are fighting a holy war for their own salvation.
So how do we correct course? If we are forgetting history, if the rhetoric of group identity is dragging us back toward ideological cliffs, and if we are caught in a meaning crisis that turns politics into holy war.
How do we stop the cycle?
Yeah, how do we avoid just flipping to another extreme, like becoming resentful right-wing authoritarians to combat resentful left-wing authoritarians?
That is the pivotal question of our deep dive. And the ultimate solution provided in the text isn't found in a different political ideology or a new set of laws.
What is it?
It is found in a profound, radical shift in how we view human morality itself. And this brings us to the most famous, the most vital lesson drawn directly from Solzhenitsyn's agonizing time freezing and starving in the Gulag.
Right. Solzhenitsyn was stripped of everything. He was a loyal communist who was betrayed, imprisoned, and treated like an animal.
He had every reason to view the world entirely through the lens of pure victims and pure oppressors.
He had every right, historically speaking, to be consumed by resentment toward the guards and the state. But he had a revelation that shattered that paradigm.
He realized that the line dividing good and evil does not run between political parties.
It doesn't run between economic classes or nations or races.
The line dividing good and evil cuts directly through the heart of every single human being.
This is the core insight of both Solzhenitsyn and Peterson. We are all, each of us, simultaneously capable of being the oppressor and the oppressed.
Evil does not exist solely in the other, the rich, the poor, the left, the right, the colonizer, or the marginalized. It exists within you.
And crucially, it exists especially within the person who is entirely convinced of their own absolute moral purity.
The moment you believe all the evil is out there in the people you hate, you become capable of atrocities.
So if the doctrine of group identity tells you to seek vengeance because you belong to a historically oppressed class,
Or if it tells you to feel perpetual, crippling guilt because you belong to an oppressor class.
what is the alternative? Peterson outlines a very specific, deeply personal response based on this realization.
He says, it is far preferable to look at your thrownness and state forthrightly, I am indeed thrown arbitrarily into history. I therefore choose to voluntarily shoulder the responsibility of my advantages and the burden of my disadvantages.
It is a call for radical, uncompromising personal responsibility. Instead of demanding that society completely restructure itself to punish someone else for the tragedy of existence, the individual must pay for their advantages with responsibility.
If you were born smart or wealthy or in a stable country, your job isn't to feel guilty. Your job is to use that advantage to lift the burden of others.
And conversely, you are morally bound to accept your disadvantages as the heavy price you pay for the miracle of being alive.
You must strive with everything you have, not to descend into bitterness, envy, and vengeance, just because you have less to your credit and a greater burden to carry than others.
That is the ultimate antidote to the cultural rot we mentioned at the very beginning of the show.
True metamodern synthesis requires acknowledging the capacity for malevolence inside ourselves, rather than projecting it entirely onto an external enemy.
It demands humility instead of utopian arrogance. It demands that we stop trying to engineer heaven on earth through coercion and start trying to govern our own souls.
It is an incredibly difficult challenge. It asks us to transform ourselves through humility, to actually learn from the bloodshed and anguish of the 20th century, and to take personal responsibility for the suffering that characterizes the world.
It means rejecting the easy, seductive, addictive path of group resentment.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have. We started with the sheer impact of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's literary investigation, exploring how he exposed the hidden horrors of the Soviet system and proved that atrocities were a direct feature, not a bug, of Marxist ideology.
We explored the philosophical concept of thrownness and how the reduction of human beings to arbitrary group identities inevitably creates an ever-expanding net of class enemies, replacing individual innocence with a terrifying collective guilt.
We examined the psychological X-ray Peterson provides, showing how utopian visions can weaponize compassion, using the promise of a perfect future to justify horrific coercion and censorship in the present.
We debated the immutable cosmic reality of inequality and discussed how the modest humility of Western democratic systems offers a vital safeguard against totalitarian retooling.
We looked at the acute danger of historical amnesia, the terrifying statistics we seem so eager to forget, and how the collapse of shared truth and the crisis of meaning turn modern politics into a holy war.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate synthesizing lesson from the Gulag, that the line between good and evil cuts through every human heart, demanding radical personal responsibility instead of the endless cycle of collective vengeance.
It is a heavy, demanding text, but an absolutely necessary one if we want to understand the underlying currents of our modern political discourse and avoid repeating the darkest chapters of our history.
I couldn't agree more.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we've just discussed.
Give them something to think about.
If the line between good and evil truly runs through your own heart, as Solzhenitsyn insists, I want you to think about the political or cultural enemies you feel most justified in resenting today. Think about the people you feel completely, undeniably certain are the bad guys.
The ones you're sure about.
Ask yourself honestly, how much of that resentment you feel is truly a righteous demand for justice, and how much might actually be that hidden, dangerous human appetite for vengeance wearing a clever mask of virtue? Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the narratives, keep examining your own heart, and we'll see you next time.
Well, that was today's episode, Metamodernism Uncensored. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you again